Hi everybody, in this video I'm going to show you how to make a transitioned drop menu where the elements change color gradually using transitions and where the drop menu appears using pseudo classes and some CSS. So you've been using a bunch of you've used a bunch of those things separately and in the past, but this is going to kind of bring them all together and make a pretty common. It's really a pretty common effect that you see in a lot of websites. And so the first thing I'll do is start setting up the HTML. I'm just going to set up the navigation because all I really want to demonstrate is the navigation. So for my HTML, it's just going to be a nav. And that nav will contain an unordered list. You'll notice sometimes I use lists for my navs and sometimes I don't. One of the reasons it's such a good idea to use them is it gives you a structure. It gives you the unordered list element, the whole thing, the box around the list items, and then it gives you each individual item, and those are two different things that you can select. And when you have a lot of selections to make and very specific selections to make, that can really matter. In this case, it really is going to matter. So that's why, in particular, this time I'm doing this. But it is just sort of a generally good idea. So I'm just going to put a few links in here. As list items. And I'll just have list item 1, list item 2, list item 3. Then inside list item 2, at least that's the way I had it up, the way it showed in the example, was that one of the list items had a drop-down menu. They could all have a drop-down menu. I'm just going to demonstrate it for one of them. So inside one of the list items, I'll create another unordered list. This is a list inside a list because that drop-down menu is itself an unordered list. So it's a class. I'll make it drop-down. And that will contain some list items. And then I'll just call these sub 1, sub 2, and sub 3 because they're the sub menu that's within the outer menu. All right, and that's the basic structure of the navigation. So there's an unordered list. The whole thing is an unordered list with 3 list items, item 1, 2, and 3. But then item 2 itself contains another unordered list with 3 list items. So now I'll switch over to CSS. And add some styles. First, just the basics. The links. We want text decoration none, so that they aren't underlined. the whole nav, I'll just give it a font family, monospace. It's kind of, I mean, it's literally the same amount of spacing for each letter. But in this case, in most cases, most monospace fonts, I would say, as a generalization, they kind of look like typewriter typeface, but not always. I'll set my background color. Oops. List style none. I don't need any additional styling like bullet points or anything like that for my list. No margin. No padding. Now make my text white. For my list items, their background can be dark orange as well. Now remember, list items are normally I believe inline. I'm just gonna make sure that they're block. If they're already block, saying display block don't do anything at all. I'm gonna float them left. Give them a small pad of 1em. Position relative. So I'm going to set, it's going to set these list items relative to normal flow. No text decoration for the list items. Let's just see how they look so far. You can see right now they're all actually lined up. We haven't done anything to hide the sub. We haven't done anything to hide the sub elements. So they're just kind of showing up. We'll add that later. So there's going to be a transition. It'll be transitioning color. So I'm just going to say, I'm going to set a transition duration to half a second. Next, I'm going to select the A tags inside list items. Make sure those also have their color set. And now the text is white. Next, I'll set what happens when you hover over a list item. Set the background color to red. Now, it's switching to red. And so you notice how when I hover over parts of these buttons, they don't actually show that it's a link. So if I have to actually hover over the text itself for it to show that it's a link. You know, but you could tell it's a link because it turns from the regular mouse pointer, it's like an arrow, to the one that looks like a hand. I can specify exactly what the cursor is. I can say cursor pointer for the whole list item. Hover, and now you can see I'm actually not hovering over the text, and it's still changing the pointer. All right, so I've got to deal with what happens. So I've got unordered list with list items inside the unordered list. I've also got an unordered list inside an individual list item. Oops, I just erased that by accident. So it's a UL with an li inside it, and then a UL inside that. So the inner, this is the sub. This is the sub 1, sub 2, sub 3. That's all contained inside this UL. This inner UL that's inside a single list item. Initially, its visibility will be hidden. We don't want to actually be able to see it. It's supposed to only show up when it's hovered over. Set opacity to 0. So absolute positioning will be good for the submenu because it's going to be positioned relative to its its container element, or like its ancestor element, which is the naming for the naming for all the positionings is kind of confusing because they don't necessarily do what they sound like. You'd think absolute would be absolute, but it's actually relative to another container. Everything's relative to a container, really, in CSS. So it's a bit misleading, but this is actually going to set its position to a specific location, but a specific location compared to its container element. This will get a transition as well. Just say all 0.5. I just want to transition everything for 0.5 seconds. I'll give it a small margin because they'll be stacked one on top of the other. So I'll put a margin on the top. Unlike the others, they have their margin on the left. Maybe it was padding, but I think it should look fine. So it's positioning will just be 0 pixels from the left edge of the container element. So it should be lined up. It should be left aligned with item 2 in the list. Then initially it'll be set to display none, so it won't actually show up. We shouldn't be able to see it. Still see it. Did I mess something up? All right. I found the error. I didn't close one of my list items. I believe I didn't close it correctly. So and you should make this change as well, because if you copied what I did in your HTML, you'll have this error. I closed my list item here, my second list item, but remember all that other stuff is inside the second list item. So it actually needs to be closed way down here after all of the things that are contained inside it, all of those sub items. So that should fix that problem. There we go. All right, so now that the HTML isn't broken, the CSS works. And finally, to finish this up, so when the list item inside an unordered list is hovered over, and this is something different, this little greater than sign, sort of left, this angle bracket, just means only when exactly this is inside it. So this means when you have an unordered list, and specifically an unordered list contained inside another unordered list with a list item that's hovered over. So it's like this exact situation. This only applies to the exact situation that we're talking about when we have the submenu showing up. That thing will have the visibility set to visible, opacity set to 1, display block. Not a huge fan of how it's displaying. Let's see what happens if I set a minimum width. Min width. That looks better. So you can see the submenu is lined up with its left edge along the edges of, right along the side of item 2, or sort of its parent element. That's because of this absolute positioning, 0 pixels from the left. Remember, absolute, pretty misleading. It means its position is, it's absolute in the sense that its position is very specific, but it's like specified according, it's still actually relative to something else, which is its container element. In this case, it's 0 pixels from the left edge of it. You can see we have the orange to red transitions. It's fading from one to the other, and it's dropping the drop menu down when you hover over the second item.